Ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome each and every one of you here on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Institute and also the University of New South Wales. This is positively my favourite room. Unfortunately, it doesn't belong to the University of New South Wales, although I have to say there's some movement for the Australian Human Rights Institute to take it over. Ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming you, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this wonderful room stands. We're talking here of the Gadigal people, and we absolutely pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and in the case of a university, emerging. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be allowed as Chancellor of the University of New South Wales to welcome you. I must say I pushed a little bit to get this role. Many might say it was bestowed upon me, but I had to push. And why did I push? The reason I pushed is that the Australian Human Rights Institute, in my opinion, embodies so many of the things I value about the University of New South Wales. It's not just theoretical. It's basically a group that's come together to bring research together with arguments and ideas, to bring also the idea of actually championing ideas within the community and actually bringing some reform, if one can possibly do that these days. We are enormously impressed by the work that the Institute's already done. Those of you who've followed it will know that they've already done wonderful work on Australia's Modern Slavery Act. They've highlighted Australia's significant impact on climate change from our fossil fuel exports, and they've addressed gender inequalities and inequities in health and medical research. And so here they are again, looking this time at the pursuit of diversity and inclusion. The big question, is it dead? I want to also say, if I may, that I was asked to give a plug for the Global Student Fellowship. Now, one of the things that happens to chancellors is often they're asked to do things and then they don't trust them and they put on a very good movie that does it for you. But there were a few things that weren't said, and I think through modesty. There were 20 positions offered in the last 12 months or so, and there were 200 applicants for it. And when Justine, who I'll introduce to everybody who knows her in a second, basically looks around for funding, she does that from philanthropic services, and she's worked out ways of doing it. And for those who know her, you know you can't say no to Justine. But if you do know anybody who can help, this is a need. This is a need that's fantastic for people who want to work in human rights. This is a need which is fantastic for students who want to see other aspects of life. I'm really proud that our university is associated with this. I think that this provocation series, which is being launched tonight, is just what the community needs. We need to chat about things, and I've been lucky. I've been talking to some of the people who are going to be talking to you tonight, and boy, they've got a lot to say, but also it's well worth listening to, particularly when they comment and say how good UNSW is. Ladies and gentlemen, my final role here tonight is to introduce Justine Nolan to you. I'm pretty sure that all of you know her better than I know myself. Justine is the director of the Australian Human Rights Institute. She's also a professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales. In her part-time, she sits on the council of the university and torments the Chancellor whenever she can. She's globally recognised not for tormenting the Chancellor, but for her work and connections between business and human rights. She works closely with government, companies, international institutions and NGOs, and in my opinion, she's a first-rate person. Over to you, Justine.
Thank you, David. Good evening and welcome to the launch of the Australian Human Rights Institute's annual event series, the new provocation series that we're launching tonight with the question of, is the pursuit of diversity and inclusion dead? Thank you so much for coming out in this weather. Human rights is all about building resilience. So, you're now part of the club. Thank you so much to David for opening our event tonight and setting the bar so high on speaking with content and humour. It is true, I have been tormenting him for the last 3 years, and it's fair to say that my probably diverse opinions have sent him to the edge many times, but he has built resilience. And it's no relation to my role on the council, which is why he is stepping down shortly from UNSW. He just says it's years of torment. So thank you, David, for joining us tonight in this beautiful space. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging and paying our respects to the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, and in particular recognise their enduring connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to country. For the sake of future generations, I think we all know that we need to do a lot more than pay respect. This country has always been a place of teaching and learning and knowledge sharing. And as we open our discussion on diversity and inclusion, we should also begin by recognising that the impacts of colonisation are ongoing, that true inclusion in Australia must prioritise justice for First Nations people, including embracing their leadership on the issues we're going to draw out tonight. So tonight we're talking about whether the pursuit of diversity and inclusion is dead. And this topic couldn't be more timely. Obviously, I haven't been speaking to Trump and asking him to put out new executive orders each week, but he's been doing that on our behalf. We've also had members of our own political parties making contributions in that way as well. Across the world in the last year, 6 months, longer than that, particularly in the United States, which we'll talk about, but we've seen global politics shifting and there's been a pushback against greater discussion around things like diversity. So tonight, some of the issues we're going to touch on are around whether the state of diversity and inclusion, whether it is dead or it's simply evolving into something else. What impact is there for Australia from these global political shifts? And in particular, the role of government, business and media and how they're reacting to it. So we have a fantastic panel with us tonight to debate these issues. And I should say at the start that we are obviously down one panellist if you sort of registered or look at who should be here. We were going to be joined by Professor Noreen Young, and who is a workplace diversity expert at UTS. She also brings a very unique perspective from First Nations perspective and culturally diverse heritages. Unfortunately, her flight has been scheduled and cancelled 5 times today. So she's had a lovely stay at the airport since 11 a.m. So she's very distressed that she's not here. She's a great person and we're sorry that she couldn't join us today. But, not to play down Nick, Sally and Hugh, so we have with us 3 great people. So in the middle we have Sally Sitou, who's been the federal member for Reid since 2022. She's the daughter of Chinese parents who fled Laos because of the Vietnam War, and she has spoken passionately about the education and work opportunities that her family has been able to pursue while in Australia. Before entering politics, she was brought together an organisation called the Mosaic Network, which brought together staff from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Unfortunately, it was at the University of Sydney, but otherwise it was all good with it. To my right is Nick Bryant, who has had a very distinguished career with the BBC and became to be regarded as one of its finest foreign correspondents. An American specialist, he's reported on the presidencies of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. He's the author of a number of books, including one, When America Stopped Being Great, A History of the Present. And that wasn't this year, by the way. He's written for a huge range of newspapers, including print media, The Economist, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and our own local Sydney Morning Herald. And finally, on the far right, Hugh Kretser, who is the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Hugh doesn't need much introduction to a human rights crowd. For more than 2 decades, Hugh has played a critical role in Australia in advancing human rights. Prior to joining the Commission, he was in charge of the Europe Justice Commission in Victoria and the Human Rights Law Centre in Melbourne. He's worked for a wide range of human rights organisations, and at the very beginning of his career, all his way back, advised companies about anti-discrimination law as well. So let's get started. And let me just give you a little bit of background before I throw my first question out. So in April this year, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said in a speech at an American university, diversity and inclusion policies create a level playing field after centuries of systemic racism and misogyny. He said that real equality means reckoning with history and actively addressing the injustices that are embedded with our system. What he said is that we need to have some hard conversations around issues like diversity and what inclusion really looks like. In our own country, we saw this debated a little bit in the lead up to this year's federal election. Then opposition leader Peter Dutton condemned what he called the woke agenda. He said he wouldn't stand in front of an Indigenous flag if elected. He vowed to cut funding and eliminate cultural diversity staffers among the public service. He had plans to cut down on the woke curriculum, where he said kids were being indoctrinated with something that's the agenda of others. So obviously that didn't work out quite so well for him. But nevertheless, we know that there's a lot of issues that are still very much live in Australia and globally. So starting in the US, I think it's worth sort of looking at the US first before we come back to Australia. President Trump has taken what some might call a strong position on issues around diversity. So within days of taking the presidency, he ordered the elimination of government diversity programs. He ordered that only two sexes, male and female, should be recognised. He confirmed transgender members of the military would be removed, and he announced that the first time in its history, the US would have an official language, English. And I'm not even going to get started on the Gulf of America. The Pentagon has ordered military leaders to review all the books in their library that address racism and sexism, and the Smithsonian museums are madly searching about the content to ensure that they are replacing any content that has diverse or ideologically driven language with what they say is unifying, historically accurate and constructive descriptions. Trump has commented that they spend too much time on the bad aspects of slavery. The good aspects would be quite short, but we'll come to that. And then just yesterday, we saw the US Supreme Court hand down a decision that supported immigration raids targeting people based on their race and language, which one of the dissenting judges said made Latinos fair game to be seized at any time. So we're going to start with the US, but it's not just the US that these issues have been happening. In Eastern Europe, we've also seen a crackdown on diversity, particularly based on race and sexual orientation. UNSW's Professor Christy Newman has pointed to the dangers of these movements forging close connections with political leaders that provides legitimacy. What we've seen happen, I think, in the last year is people sort of saying the quiet bit out loud. So let's start, before we get to Australia, with the US. So Nick, you've spent a lot of time in the US. What do you think has driven President Trump and his second administration to make this a driving force and sort of a central policy of what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer it, can I just say some of the nice things about UNSW that I said in private, in public? I think it's brilliant that we're having this conversation. I think you could not have this conversation at a better time. I think it's brilliant that you're having a diversity festival. I think it's brilliant that you're kicking off this whole program of events. And UNSW, one of the reasons why it's now one of the top 20 universities in the world in the rankings is because it is a campus bereft of ivory towers. It is a campus that has always been focused on practical solutions. It has always been a campus that wants to engage with the community. The very fact that we are not meeting tonight on the USW home turf and we're out in the community speaks to that. And so
Justine, give him a job already.
and I promise
I didn't send him any of that, but David, did you speak to him beforehand?
I'm not making a pitch to follow David as the Chancellor of UNSW, I promise you.
The job is open if anybody wants to apply tonight. The Provost is here, you can speak to him about it directly.
As to the question, look, in 2024, the American people were presented with the starkest choice in a presidential election that they've ever had, and that includes the election in 1860, which was before the Civil War. You had a black woman who was the daughter of immigrants, who was a prosecutor, a lawyer, somebody who believes in the majesty of the law, up against a felon with a long history of racism, with a long history of misogyny, with a long history of nativism, literally somebody who made his name in the political realm, questioning the very legitimacy of Barack Obama, America's first African-American president. And if, like me, you see in his election in 2016 that it was partly a backlash to having an African-American president. Let's not be too reductionist about this. I'm not claiming everybody who voted for Trump was racist and everybody hated the idea of an African-American president. I'm not claiming that at all, but it was an element. And some of the early support that Trump got particularly was from far-right groups who liked what he was saying about Barack Obama. So how do you interpret his second win? I mean, one way of thinking about it is another backlash, this time against the racial reforms that came into place after the George Floyd summer. You remember George Floyd was the African-American who got murdered by the police in Minneapolis. And I think to a certain extent it was a reaction as well to some of the gains made by women after the Me Too campaign. So that has emboldened Trump, and he won a very clear victory. I mean, given the choice between those two very different candidates, America did choose Trump. I mean, he won 7 of the battleground states. He was the first Republican candidate in 20 years to win the popular vote. He didn't win more than 50%. I think that's really worth pointing out. He won 49.8%. And let's not exaggerate the scale of the victory in the same way that he does. It was not a landslide. On the historical scale, it was a small win. Had 230,000 votes changed in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, we would be here tonight talking about America's first female president. So it wasn't a big win, but it was an emphatic win. It was a clear-cut win, and that win emboldened him to do exactly the things that you have been describing. And one of the first acts was to sign that executive order, and I actually looked at the wording of it today. I mean, there are so many executive orders, don't they? And he flourishes them with a thing like this. But on the very first day, one of his very first acts, the Biden administration forced illegal and immoral discrimination programs going by the name Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, DEI, into virtually all aspects of the federal government in areas ranging from airline safety to the military. You know, he wiped all that history out with a flourish of his Sharpie pen.
Well, that's the good news. So, Hugh, when you look at that, you know, what's been going on, and it's hard to, sort of ignore what's going on in America. It's so much in our faces all the time. How do you see that playing out in Australia? I mean, that was part of Dutton's playbook, but do you feel like it's broadened out into Australian society beyond that, post the election as well?
I think, yeah, we have to be really cognizant about the very different context in Australia, both legally, politically, and culturally. And I followed the Prime Minister's speech after the election where he said, let us join together, or words to that effect, and unify under Australia's enduring foundations of fairness, equality and respect for one another. And he spoke about no one being left behind and no one being held back. And so there is a very radically different message coming from the leadership of this country compared to the leadership of America. Against that context, let's be clear, we've just had rallies across the country. Melbourne, where I grew up in and lived until recently, had neo-Nazis walking brazenly on the street. You know, there's explicit calls for Australia for the white man. We had communities across the country, particularly Indian communities, feeling deeply unsafe and saying, should I go out on this weekend across the country? We've got anti-trans sentiment here in Australia. We've got Queensland who's paused public health treatment for trans kids. We've got rising racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism, and we've got the impact of the Voice referendum where Australians rejected what was a pretty modest proposal to give First Nations people a better say in things that affect their lives. So that's the context here in Australia, I think when you look at the question for tonight is diversity, equity and inclusion dead? No, of course it isn't. And I look at things like the Respect at Work report that the Australian Human Rights Commission did about making our workplaces safer, more equal and fairer, particularly for women, addressing sex discrimination and sexual harassment. That is a big shift across both the Morrison government and the Albanese government implemented every single one of those recommendations. We now have a positive duty for every employer in the country to eliminate, as far as practicable, sexual harassment, sex discrimination and other unlawful conduct, and we're the regulator for that positive duty now. So very different context, and but those global wins, particularly for companies that have connections or headquarters in the US. I've spoken to people who work in those companies and how it's had a chilling effect on their ability and what they say and do about human rights and equality issues.
So Sally, staying with sort of the political environment, this year we elected the most diverse group of politicians ever sitting in Parliament at the moment. So on the face of it, we have a very diverse group. Do you feel, though, it then means that we're hearing those voices, despite being, because one of the accusations around diversity and inclusion sometimes is that we tick boxes around it, we put people in positions, but we don't then listen to what they're saying. So what's your feeling around that in terms of politics at the moment?
I think one of the great things about this new parliament is that there is diversity from so many aspects, certainly cultural diversity, gender diversity, but also something that we haven't seen in politics in a long time, a diversity of ages as well. We've got the youngest senator at the age of 21, and we've got many who are Gen Z, millennials. We've got 2 millennial cabinet ministers. And I think what that means is they bring different perspectives to the decision-making process. But I am going to be a bit contrarian here, and I'm going to say the term diversity and inclusion I do think is dead, not the concept. The concept I am fully supportive of. The term, though, I think we need to do a better job of explaining what this means. We need to do a better job of letting people know why this is important. And that is what I've been trying to do as a member of Parliament in one of the most diverse parliaments that we've got. Because when we hear diversity and inclusion, we have inherent good feelings about it, that this is going to mean we get better decision making, that we lift people up. We think it means good things. But when others hear it, they attach a different meaning to it. And my husband is a great litmus test for all things outside of politics. I think he voted Labor the very first time when he had to vote for me. But he listens to this kind of like tech bro American podcast called All In. And there's a couple of common threads in this podcast. One is the supremacy of the tech world to solve all problems. The other is like, how can you make more money, which is kind of what he listens to it for. And then the third is they rail against, and they call it DEI. That's their shorthand for diversity and inclusion. And their shorthand is you're promoting people who don't deserve to be there. We're having to try to get more women into tech when they're undeserving and they're not as good as us. So their framing of what diversity and inclusion is totally negative. But one of the hosts of this podcast is a guy who was an executive in Facebook, and he's made billions in smart investments. He's a Sri Lankan-born tech finance entrepreneur. And if you track his story, his family, down and out, had to survive on welfare in Canada, really struggled. But he came of age during the time of the Rodney King riots. And where he was living in Ontario, the government there had a program to help support young people who were of minority background. The program was all about, you go get yourself a job, the government will pay your wage so that you're not a drain on that company. So he used that program to go pitch himself a job at an investment company and then springboarded that into extraordinary success. He is someone who has directly benefited from a DEI program, but he rails against it for other people because the concept of DEI for them has become so narrow cast into this idea that we're promoting people above what they should be promoted. We're having to get women into the tech world. And so I guess what I would like to see is for us to stop using the words diversity and inclusion and be specific about what we mean by it.
So, I love the music finishing you out there. And also thanks to the 3 American tech guys just sitting there who just came from the tech conference down the road. One of which is my husband. Thank you for joining us.
We all love our husbands.
I know none of them voted for Trump, so that I can say. But let's stick with that terminology a little bit. Nick, do you see a big difference in the way diversity and inclusion is discussed here versus DEI in America?
Oh, can I approach that question by telling a story?
You're a journalist. You've never asked the question, answer the question I've asked.
Exactly. No, it's the art of deflection. 4 years ago, we arrived back in Australia, having been in the States, and we were staying in a quarantine hotel because it was the middle of COVID. And on the first Saturday morning, we heard this kind of muffled roar of a crowd down below. We went, what's that? And it was actually an anti-lockdown protest. And we turned on the TV later, and we saw them carrying Trump flags, flags that we would ordinarily see in Mississippi or Michigan were being paraded in Sydney and in Melbourne. And at the time, the lockdowns for American conservatives became this real cause célèbre. Tucker Carlson bemoaned the fact that the gun laws were so tight in Australia after Port Arthur that people couldn't take up arms against the government. You had Candace Owens, who was a right-wing talk show host, literally saying the US Marines should invade Australia to liberate the people. You had Ron DeSantis suggesting that America might break off diplomatic ties. And during that period, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, "Don't Australia my America." And I remember thinking the complete opposite, "Don't America my Australia." And I think Australia has done that. I mean, one way of interpreting the victory of Anthony Albanese in this year's federal election was the Australians used an emphatically Australian democratic model to elect an emphatically Australian leader and reject a kind of a Trumpism that was starting to emerge in the Liberal Party. I don't think Peter Dutton was a Trump impersonator, by the way. I think he was a bit more like Ron DeSantis. There was a kind of joylessness about it.
Worked out well for Ron as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of need the personality to pull it off, and I think that's Ron DeSantis found that. And I think, I'm not making a political point here. It's just an observation. I think Dutton had that same problem as well. He just didn't have the personality to pull off Trump's policies. You need that kind of charismatic personality. He didn't have it, and I think in other ways too, Australia is saying we don't want to be too heavily influenced by what's happening in America right now. We don't want it in our politics. We don't want it in our corporate life. We have built things here that we should try and safeguard. And it's not inevitable that we have to adopt the American way. And I think at the moment there's a kind of assertion almost of Australianness to say we will do things our way. We do not have to be overly influenced by what's happening in the States by now.
Yeah, I mean, Hugh, do you also think it's partly diversity and inclusion initiatives are very different from the way our anti-discrimination laws are set up as well? But we have this broad understanding. You've mentioned race and sex as well, and obviously age and disability rights. But do you think we think about it differently because we're coming from a different base or a bit different legal framework as well?
Yeah, I think those terms aren't very familiar or weren't very familiar to Australians, and I completely agree with you, Sally, on the terminology and explaining it. Tim Sopomosan, the former race commissioner, is now at Cambridge, and he did some really interesting research in response to the Trump agenda, basically saying, what do people in Britain think about DEI, or they've got their, I think they call it inclusion and diversity ID in the UK. And part of his conclusions from that was that the language we use is really important. people feel very nervous about saying the wrong thing and being castigated for that. People feel it's an us and them. People feel that, and this is a broader critique, that human rights is for particular minorities. That's not for all of us. And so the message for people who care about human rights and equality, and note that I use those words instead of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is one that we need to communicate much better. And so if you look at the structure of the Human Rights Commission, for example, we have a commissioner for age, sex, disability, race, First Nations, children, and a broad-based human rights commissioner. So sort of embodied in our structure is this idea of siloisation. Why is that? Because they're the communities that are marginalised, who have suffered the so-called special treatment. They've suffered the injustice. We have to stand with those communities and support them, but we also have to address the critique and the kind of sentiment that drove Trump's election. I think followed it more so the last time round, and that allows someone like Steve Bannon the last time around to say, let them call you a racist and wear it as a badge of honour, and that is tapping into this kind of sentiment, because there's this people who say, well, the modern world is increasingly not for me, and we don't talk enough about class. And I think a lot about my own background as a son of a Sri Lankan migrant. So in one sense, I tick a box for a diversity checklist, if you like. Person of colour, culturally diverse background. I grew up speaking English. And I've worked with people in human rights who are white men from deeply poor backgrounds who have disability and mental illness in their backgrounds. They have way more human rights lived experience than I do from the privileged background that I had. And so for me, we need to have a much more sophisticated conversation about how to address equality issues and inequality, and we need to make sure that people do not feel left out of this change, which we absolutely need, and that we explain it properly, why we need a level playing field. And I'll just finish by talking about an article a colleague of mine, First Nations colleague, brilliant thinker and writer and speaker, Meena Singh, who's the Aboriginal Children's Commissioner in Victoria, and she wrote an article which you can look up online explaining why we should change the pension rules to allow Aboriginal people to access the pension at an earlier age because they're dying younger. And she talked about the critique of people getting this so-called special treatment and said, for 200 years we've got special treatment, our land's been stolen, our culture's been suppressed, our language has been banned, we've had stolen generations, etc. Expecting there to be a level playing field in the world for us, for First Nations community, is ridiculous. That's why we need it. So we need to take the time and explain clearly.
Can I just jump in there and make a comment about how Trump weaponized sort of DEI language? You know, one of the most effective ads that the Republicans ran during the campaign was the ad that said, Trump is for you, Kamala is for they, them. So the use of those pronouns and turning them up, and it was an incredibly effective, politically speaking, ad. It just went off online, especially in the manosphere. It's worth pointing out as well that, you know, Trump won a majority of white women in 2024. He won a majority of white women in 2020. He won a majority of white women in 2016. Even after the Access Hollywood tape, he won a majority of white women. So it's not just the manosphere, and, you know, there's a lot of women who are voting for Trump. Kamala Harris was labelled a DEI hire. You know, they are using this language in a way, they've weaponized it. And, you know, there is an absolutism on the left right now. There's a kind of gotcha. If you don't get if you're not fluent in the language of intersectionality, you know, suddenly, you know, somebody's, you know, and there is that kind of, and if you live in the Rust Belt, and you feel like an economic castaway in a system of globalization, you know, the notion of white privilege doesn't mean a great deal towards you either. You don't feel privileged. So it's finding ways to come up with a new vocabulary, not be quite obsessed about how you apply the existing vocabulary, and in the workplace, I mean, there's this very strong economic case to make for diversity. You know, the McKinsey study is often quoted, isn't it, as showing that firms that embrace diversity just do a lot better for obvious reasons. So it's finding ways to counter that. My worry is that we'll end up making too many concessions to Trumpism. The Democrats faced a dilemma at the end of in the early 90s. You know, how do you win back the White House? The Republicans basically had sort of had a lock on the White House since the late 60s, partly as a white backlash against the reforms of the Civil Rights Movement, which were pursued by Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. You'll have heard of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. The Republicans used the Southern strategy repeatedly to dominate presidential politics. And Bill Clinton came along and thought, how do we sort of reverse this? And one of the ways that he reversed it was to, in a couple of very symbolic ways in the 1992 campaign, he basically made it very clear we are not beholden anymore to African Americans and the African Americans in the Democratic Party. And my worry right now is that the Democrats will do something like that, and they will throw trans people under a bus, you know, something like that. There is this concern that, you know, the Democrats think Trump's just changed the field, and he has. And my worry right now is that too many concessions will be made to Trumpism.
Yeah, so I mean, this issue of terminology, which you've raised first, Sally, I think is really important. And also where Hugh, you said that sometimes the problem of people being afraid of what to say or what to name it, that was actually raised in one of the podcasts that you talked about, Sally. I heard Zuckerberg discussing it with Joe Rogan this year when he said that, you know, we've moved too far, it's got out of hand, and anything I say now might be reported to the DEI team. He's then fired the DEI team, so he's okay now. But if we don't think about it in that language, but perhaps a sense of belonging, where does diversity and inclusion come into that? And I was struck by, in your first speech to Parliament in 2022, you said that Australia had reached this stage of being a majority migrant nation, and that you said had demonstrated a genuine embrace of modern Australia. But you also said in that speech that you had long had sort of a hesitancy about where you belonged in Australia. So from 2022 to 2025, and you look out where Australia is now in having these discussions around diversity and inclusion, do you still feel there's this sort of hesitancy around belonging? Because there was also an article that Stan Grant wrote in 2023 where he said he was looking at a picture of himself as a 7-year-old as someone who was looking out for a world, you know, where he didn't quite belong. And I was just wondering, you know, do you feel like that's changed for you?
Thanks for quoting my first speech back to me. And
you're going to play it on the video just after this.
And there's a section of my first speech that I borrowed from George Megalogenis, and it was the point about the fact that at that point we'd just tipped over into becoming a majority migrant nation. But the key point that George had pointed out, which I thought was fantastic, was the way it was received in Australia, not with backlash, not with people kind of being outraged by that, but it happened and it was fine. And I think that, to me, was something quite powerful because I grew up at a time when Pauline Hanson was making her first speech, and some of the rhetoric that was coming out from her, also from John Howard about Asian migrants in this country, and then followed by the Cronulla riots. And so I think that was a real moment in time for me, that first speech, to be able to recognise how far I have come, but also how far our country has come. But if I think about some of the more recent comments from our political leaders, it's a reminder for me that progress is not linear. People like Pauline Hanson are still around, still saying the things that she's saying. She's still in our Senate. Those things will always come up because I make many speeches about how we are a multicultural success story, and I believe that to the very core, but it is a challenge. It's a challenge to be a multicultural success story. It doesn't come easy. If we wanted to make it easy and have social cohesion, the best way to do that would be to have everyone of the same faith, of the same culture, but we embrace multiculturalism because of everything that it brings. The dynamism, the fact that it was because of multiculturalism that we were able to then become the great modern country that we have today. You know, from the Italian migrants that built the Snowy Hydro, then paving the way for successive migrants to come after them and prove that we are a great addition to this country. But that there is a fragility to that is tested all the time. And it is most tested when people are going through their own challenging times. And I make an observation of what has been happening in the US, not as astutely as Nick, but from my observation of what is happening over there is that economic inequality that is happening, that that idea that if you worked hard in a factory that you'd be able to build a good life for yourself, that is getting harder and almost impossible for some people who are living out in Alabama, in Louisiana. Like, that means that they've got to go out and search for someone to blame. Like, why is my lot in life so hard when I'm working so hard? So who can I blame? And the easy answer are migrants. Migrants are coming in, they're taking my jobs, they're not worthy of being in this country. We, and I agree very much with Hugh, we are in a very unique situation in Australia, but we also have a fracturing of our society. We have to make sure that if you work hard, you can buy a house. Because in my first term of Parliament, I did a lot of door knocking, and you quickly learn about your community when you're out door knocking. And I could feel it turn. I could feel the community turn when the cost of living pressures started to bite. Because when I went door knocking, they would complain to me about a first order issue that they'd have, like traffic or congestion or why is housing so expensive? And then the second thing they'd say, it's because you're letting too many migrants in. So the thing that they're most concerned about is a legitimate concern. Why can't their kids buy a home? Why is traffic so bad? Why can't they get in to see a doctor? But where they put the blame, that's what we need to change.
Well, the scapegoating is a real problem. In America, in those Rust Belt communities, 75% of those jobs have been eradicated through automation. They had nothing to do with China. They had nothing to do with immigrants. It was just that Trump made immigrants the scapegoat. And there's a real risk now that we're going to have the same thing in AI. I mean, AI is going to wipe out a lot of jobs. Another kind of, I mean, in some ways, I mean, Trump was a revolt against the robots, but Trump turned it into a revolt against immigration. And I worry now with AI, if you look at some of the sort of projections of white-collar jobs that are going to be wiped out in the same way that blue-collar jobs have been wiped out over the last 40 years, I think it's really worrying, and it's going to create even more of those tensions. I think Sally's absolutely right. I mean, politics works when an economy works. One of the big stories in America over the past 40 years has been a sort of huge inequalities. You know, political polarization follows income polarization. You can literally track them on a graph. They move in tandem. And, you know, you've heard shades of that here in Australia with the housing debate. You know, the housing problem is a taxation system that's been based, you know, all the negative gearing and all that kind of stuff, giving advantages to baby boomers over younger buyers. It's been a supply problem, not enough houses being built. It's a regulation problem. You know, some of the regulations are too stringent. It's not an immigrant problem. And when we hear political rhetoric around that, you know, that's deeply worrying, and that's shades of Americanization.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to dig down a little bit, because you can paint a good story around diversity, and diversity is obviously a lot more than immigration, and we're just touching on some issues tonight. But I guess, I mean, sometimes I feel like we are becoming more diverse in sort of, you know, there's a lot more pockets of it popping up, but at the same time, it seems to be quite siloed. So there's more diverse people talking to each other, and we're not necessarily having communication between diverse groups. Do you think that is true, Hugh, or do you think, I mean, I feel a bit like in Australia, there's lots of success stories you can get, but there's lots of siloed diverse views where we're not willing to tolerate other views.
I think the polarisation is a real problem. I think that's driven by social media and the media, who has a commercial interest in that kind of division and polarisation. And you mentioned belonging in your question, and I'm really glad you did, because over the last year, probably the issue I've spent the most time on in this job is racism. And when I speak to people who've experienced racism, each form of racism has its own unique dimensions, whether it's for First Nations people or for the Jewish community or for the Muslim community. But then there are very common elements to that, and that damaging that sense of belonging to the Australian community, to Australian society, the sense of well-being and self-esteem, shedding parts of your identity to, wanting to fit, or to safety for your kids, whether they're at university or at work. And so I've also thought a lot about Australian values, and read the citizenship booklet about what it says, who we are as a community or as a society of the nation of Australia. And obviously the citizenship booklet, very controversial during John Howard years, revitalised under the Rudd government. And when you look at how the government defines what it is to be Australian, and when you look at what new citizens have to say as their pledge to become Australian, human rights values all through it. So fairness, equality, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, peaceful assembly. New citizens have to pledge to uphold human rights in Australia. And so for me, there is a way forward in this, which is human rights values. And that's why I paid very close attention to what the Prime Minister said, and I think he talked about kindness as well in one of his first speeches as well. And so against this backdrop of division and polarisation, and that there is a way forward, and for me, much stronger, we can talk about how to do this, I've got lots of ideas, but much stronger commitment in laws and policies to human rights.
But if you arrived in Australia in the last 6 months, would you necessarily think that we're making progress? I mean, it doesn't feel to me that we're moving on an upward trajectory. Do any of you feel like, I mean, Sally, you were more positive, but you're a naturally positive person. So, but I mean, you might say, okay, compared to America, we're looking good, but at the same time, we have a litany of issues here that we've all raised. Sally, did you feel like that we are, if you look at it in the next 6 months, in the last 6 months, that we are accepting more of diversity?
I think the point of, I guess if we go to the idea of multiculturalism, and it has been challenged, but how we respond to those challenges is really the test of the strength that we have behind multiculturalism. And it has been a really difficult time. The tensions in the Middle East have come onshore, and we've seen a senator make some really unfortunate remarks. Senator Hugh did something similar during their campaign towards the Chinese community. But again and again, how Australia has responded to those challenges does make me optimistic. And, like I said before, underlying all of this, there are real challenges. So if we were to take Senator Jane Hume's flippant remarks during the campaign about Chinese spies, underneath that is a real challenge. Foreign interference is a problem here, and the Director General of ASIO has said as such. Then let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we address that, instead of earmarking an entire community and suggesting that somehow they are disloyal. And that is something that was thrown at me when I first became the candidate in 2022. There were people on social media questioning whether or not I should be running because of my Chinese background, and therefore I must have some association with the Chinese Communist Party. So we don't want that, but we want to have a genuine discussion about foreign interference in this country. And I think being able to have an adult, mature, nuanced conversation about the actual issue without demonising an entire group is something that we need to work on, and is going to be ultimately how we get through these challenges.
One of the things I've noticed over the past 4 years since being back is the kind of fraying of Australia. I mean, weirdly, in that quarantine hotel, I looked across at a flag in Darling Harbour that was literally fraying. It was this metaphor for a country that was kind of pulling itself apart. I mean, Western Australia literally declared independence. I mean, Queensland...
They can have it.
Pretty much the same. I mean, the secessionist strain sort of came to the fore, didn't it? And I'm worried that ever since then we've had other... we don't talk about COVID enough, by the way, and how it's impacted us. 'Cause, COVID did lead to a rise in racism. There were a lot of people who ventriloquised Trump and called it the Chinese flu. So that was a problem. Then you had the voice referendum. Rather than this moment which brought the country together, it ended up being pretty polarising, right? Not the outcome that a lot of people in this room would have liked to see. Overlaying all that was increased sort of economic pressures, a rise in interest rates that was putting a huge number of people under mortgage stress. When Donald Trump used to say the American dream is dead, people believed him because they no longer could see how their kids would lead more abundant lives than they did. And, the Australian dream isn't in great shape either. The Australian dream, which is based on property ownership, that's not very good either if you're a young person. So you see a sort of generational fracturing, and then you overlay on that the aftermath of October the 7th and the community tensions that has exposed. So I think we're in this kind of sort of almost this perfect storm of fragmentation at the moment. And in a milieu like that, DEI becomes a sort of harder case to make in some ways, and it becomes not an issue to unite around, it becomes another issue to argue over,
Yeah. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a moment to the audience, but I just want to sort of, before we do that, if we can... If we were having this conversation in 5 years' time and we were talking about the status of diversity and inclusion in Australia and what it would want to look like, or globally, what are some of the things you think that you'd be interested in, you'd hope to see by then, Hugh?
I might do a nick and answer your previous question.
Sure.
That's all right,
Yep.
because...
Are you also going to become a journalist? It's mine.
Yeah,
Yep.
Great, thanks.
The role of the Chancellor is also open if you want to.
It's for others. I think it's easy to get depressed, but I think there's so much kindness and decency in the community, and I look at there's many, like after the voice referendum, I was pretty depressed. I was working at the Uruk Justice Commission, felt awful for my First Nations colleagues. The chair, Auntie Eleanor, who's had a lifetime of advocacy fighting for First Nations rights, and I looked at the reasons why people voted yes or no, and I looked at what people understand about the impact of colonisation on First Peoples, and Nine media organisation asked this question: do you think colonisation overall has been good or bad for First Peoples? And 40% said good, 20% said bad, and 40% said mixed, unsure. So twice as many people in Australia think colonisation has been good for First Peoples, and after the history of the Stolen Generations massacre, violence, cultural, it was hard to fathom that. But it speaks to the importance of truth-telling, and if you look at what's happening in Victoria with the first treaty legislation introduced to the Parliament this week, if you look at the absolute transformation of Aboriginal leadership there with an elected Aboriginal representative body who I worked closely with in my 2 years at Uruk, who are doing fantastic work and have built amazing capability, and some of the guys who are working there, they've spoken publicly about they did truth-telling to Uruk, and one guy was in prison previously. He's now a real community leader in that, next to the Premier in a photo this week in Parliament, and he's now a leader. And there's this huge shift in leadership capability and a huge shift in public understanding. I look at the Bringing Them Home report that the Commission did after generations of advocacy by survivors, and one of the shining lights in public understanding about injustice against First Peoples is the understanding of the Stolen Generations. Mm-hmm. And my kids know about the Stolen, they're in high school now, but they understand the Stolen Generations. And that again speaks to the power of truth-telling and the importance of empathy and understanding why is there injustice today because of that previous injustice over 200 years, and that's why we need national truth-telling. Last thing to just end on a hopeful note is the Australian story about the home to Bilo, the Murugappan family. Like for people here have done hard yards in refugee rights here, as I've done at the Human Rights Law Centre, it is hard. In LGBTI rights, we're going forward. In refugee rights, it's like hold the line and stop bad things from happening. And then you look at the story of the Murugappan family, who had, through a flawed process, their asylum claim had failed. Yet through their community connections, that town stood up for them, did a national campaign, and against all the odds, the Prime Minister came out and said, they're going to stay here. And then Alex Hawke, who was, I think, the minister at the time, was interviewed on Australian Story, and he said we should provide permanency for these people who have been here for so long and endured so much. So that, against all the odds, speaks to the kindness and decency that is there if people have proximity or empathy with the injustice, and that gives me hope in terms of this area and what lays ahead.
So there's some glimpses of hope there, and I guess what we're looking for is more kindness.
Yes. Well, the 2025 election results.
Huge hope there.
Hope that gives everyone hope.
So I'd like to open up for questions, and Lily and Drew have got some microphones. They're going to walk around the room. If you'd like a question, please raise your hand. Can I just ask, because there's a memory seared in, something seared in my experience of a few years ago, which is always something happens sometimes at human rights events that Andy and I were at. I asked for questions, and preferably not comments if you could keep your question short, and I looked around the room to find someone reasonably sane, and a man stood up and I said, yes sir, and he said, actually I don't have a question, and I thought, here goes a comment. He said, I have a song. And he pulled out a ukulele. So if any of you have your ukulele with you tonight, please keep it down. We would love to hear a song later, but that's not for right now. So we do have a question over here. And if you could just say your name and your question, thank you.
Yeah, hello. My name's Sally. I'm an academic, so I really appreciate the importance of a question rather than a comment. Thank you to the panel for a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. My question asks whether DEI is dead for some and not for others. The elephant in the room is the widespread and systemic crackdown on any expressions or act of support for the human rights of those currently being subjected to a campaign of extermination in Palestine. A campaign which I'll note was also funded and facilitated, rubber-stamped by Biden and Harris. We are in an unprecedented situation where what is now widely recognised as genocide is unfolding in front of our eyes on the back of an unlawful military occupation lasting almost 80 years. And it's now become unacceptable simply to state those facts, to condemn that genocide and call for our governments to stop supplying weapons components to the state committing the genocide. And to do so in a workplace or in a public setting risks censure and significant consequences for one's employment and livelihood. There are too many examples for me to mention. So my question is, how have we reached this point where simply by calling out the war crimes of a state and asking for the human rights of a particular group to be recognised, you are risking serious repercussions for your work and false, baseless accusations of racism?
Thank you. I'm going to take another question as well. So we'll take two more as we go along. So thank you for your question, and we'll go, yep.
Thank you. My name is Ro Coronius. I work with organisations in managing their human rights impacts, their impacts on people. My question is, wherefore art the Bill of Rights for Australia? Is it time now for us to look at that? And the second comment I'd like to sort of make is, we observe in the media a continual, almost barrage, non-stop, of a particular point of view. We're spectators to it. And I feel that rather than us sort of taking that in, is it time for us to role model and react and demonstrate how the models of human rights that we all want in society, rather than just accept what's being given to us through media channels and social media?
Great, thank you. Was there one more before we, one down here? I don't know where the microphones are going. Oh, sorry, I'll take that one then. I'll come to you next. Yep.
Thank you. My name's Peter, and my question is, DEI was in part a response to not using language of civil rights and human rights. So can the lack of progress in recent times be attributed to this adoption of equity and diversity and inclusion language? And is it time to just go back to talking about human rights and civil rights?
Thank you so much. So we'll start with those three, and I feel like, Hugh, you might have set up some of those questions for yourself if you planted people in the crowd. Sorry about that. So one of them is around the question around terminology, which we've also talked about, and whether this diversity and inclusion language has actually confused us more than advanced us with it. Another one was sort of reclaiming, in some ways, the dialogue from the media. What can we do about that? The position and role of a Human Rights Act. I know you planted that one, I'm sure. Except I know, Rose, so it wasn't the planned. And the other one is the ability to speak out and say what you like, in this case, in particular, in relation to the Middle East and Gaza and genocide. And I would add on to that also the crackdown in Australia, in particular around protest laws. So it's more broadly, we've seen in Australia in the last couple of years, issues not only around that, but also particularly around climate protests and others, where our laws are getting more and more restrictive, particularly at a state level, where it is becoming more and more difficult to protest. So who would like to start with any of those easy questions?
I'm happy to start, and thanks, really good questions. I'll start in the order they came. So the issue about protest rights for a start, that we're getting media inquiries every week about this, and it's fascinating to see how the media inquiries are coming, because it's either the Harbour Bridge protest, where people are protesting the injustice of what's happening in the occupied territories in Gaza, and it's the controversy around the protests in Melbourne, the ongoing pro-Palestinian protests and their impact on the Jewish community and disrupting Melbourne's business and life. And then it's the anti-migration rallies, white supremacists on the steps of Parliament, and broad-based anti-migration rallies across the country. And now I think there's another proposal for a rally on the Harbour Bridge, but for a very different purpose. So we've published an explainer about this, about how to reconcile the right to protest with the right to be free from vilification and hate speech, and where you draw a line, and law enforcement draws a line about saying if you're going into incitement to violence, or if you're promoting racial vilification and racial hatred, then that's when you intervene. And so that's published, it's online for us. When it comes to workplaces, it becomes, there's particular workplaces who are being ripped apart by these debates, universities, philanthropy, arts organisations and social justice organisations, and you put an overlay of artistic freedom or academic freedom on it, and it creates particular complexities. I want the Human Rights Commission to be helpful in this regard, to help employers to navigate these areas better, because you're seeing repeated examples of where employers are getting it wrong. And you can point to the Antoinette Lattouf case, where when I started in the job and I looked at these issues, I'm like, well, Fair Work Act protects against discrimination on the grounds of political opinion. What does the case law say about what political opinions are protected? Well, we now have a federal court decision that is very clear about the kinds of political opinions that are protected, and found that the ABC got it wrong in terms of that termination. And Nick and I were talking about impartiality in journalism, and the ABC's it potentially had a defence in terms of inherent requirements of impartiality, but it couldn't rely on that defence because ABC journalists are sharing opinions about a whole range of things publicly, and they're now responding to that. So this is a really difficult area of law for employers to get right, and they're getting it wrong, and because there's intersecting laws about making sure your staff are safe, making sure you protect diversity of all staff, making sure that you respect freedom of expression and freedom of association. CPSU for public servants, this is really acute for, we're government of the Australian Public Service, there's particular requirements about impartiality, and so the CPSU has some pretty good guidance for its members and APS staff around that, where there's a particular overlay of impartiality. Human Rights Act, absolutely. I talked about Australian values being connected to human rights. If we want a way to strengthen our democracy and address the polarisation and provide unity in the diversity and strength in diversity, Human Rights Act is one way of doing that, and it's long overdue. We've got successful Human Rights Acts all around the world. In 1986, when our organisation was set up, we were supposed to have a Human Rights Act at the same time. It hasn't happened for a whole range of reasons. There's now a recommendation from the Parliament's own Human Rights Committee to have a Human Rights Act. There's a community campaign. Others have done polling around it that shows it would be a popular reform and it would help to address the kind of things that we're talking about. And on language, yeah, I talk about human rights and equality.
Great. Sally or Nick, would you want to pick up on any of those questions?
Mainly the point around protesting and people's ability to be able to express themselves freely. That's obviously something that we guard and we want to protect. And I think more and more Australia is becoming a real beacon for freedom of expression. When we look at countries around the world, I see this week that in Nepal there are a number of young people who were killed at a protest, and the ability for Australians here to be able to express themselves freely, I think, is something that we all should protect. But like Hugh said, it does come with some guardrails around what you could be doing to others during your protest. And in the term that I have been in Parliament, the kind of ratcheting up of intense feeling within the community has really heightened to a stage where I can absolutely understand, because what we are seeing on our TV screens and seeing what is happening in Gaza is deeply, deeply distressing. And I think we all want that conflict to end as quickly as possible and for aid to be able to get in and for civilians to be protected. The challenge we are finding here is that that protest is straying away from being peaceful. And when that happens, and I'm not talking about the Sydney Harbour Bridge march, which was peaceful, and a lot of the protests have been very peaceful, and people have been fierce advocates for something that they believe strongly in. But what we have started to see is damaging of property, of firebombing of synagogues, and I think we should all say that type of protest is not okay.
Can I just talk about the language? Because I think it's really interesting. I'd love to know the history of DEI, actually, and when that first took hold. It seems to be quite recent. I don't know if anybody knows it, but I don't know the history of that terminology. I do know the history of affirmative action. Affirmative action just started in the Kennedy administration because they thought it had alliterative appeal. Affirmative action, that sounds good. So they put it in an executive order, and without really thinking what it meant. And it didn't mean what it means today. It did come to mean something stronger in the Johnson administration, actually. They did think what affirmative action had been. And Johnson was an interesting guy. Kennedy wasn't the champion of civil rights that a lot of people think. Oddly, it was a Southerner who fought for much of his career to uphold segregation, actually demolished it by pushing the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was the first time that America had universal suffrage, which is an extraordinary stat, isn't it? But America's got a very new multicultural democracy. Johnson didn't speak in jargon, he spoke in kind of analogies, and he came up with a brilliant analogy, which was if you were in a race and you put an African American on the same starting line as a white American in 1965, and you expected them to compete on an equal basis, you were living in cloud cuckoo land. There was no way that that African American could compete against a white person, given the 200 years of subjugation, the long history of segregation and slavery. And so affirmative action is the right way to deal with that. We not only need to give equality, we need to actually actively pursue that equality to make it real. And it shows the power of analogy, and it shows the power of kind of how you can sort of switch things around by talking about things in different ways. And that is probably what we need to do at the moment. I've grabbed this, I've come armed with some statistics, and they're really interesting, I think. Mentions of DEI in Fortune 100 companies have dropped by 98% from 2024 to 2025. So mentions of DEI basically, DEI is not getting any mentions anymore in Fortune 100 companies. But if you look at the company's financial filings, they are talking about diversity and related initiatives. They're just not calling it DEI anymore. So there is a way of getting around the kind of problem with the terminology of DEI is just call it something else. And that is what is happening in a lot of American firms right now, is that they're still pursuing the same policies. They're just calling them something different.
Yeah. We've got time for one more round of questions. There's one just here. Yep.
I'm Sarah, and maybe you've already answered the question. Hugh, you said you had some solutions, so I was going to ask you what your solutions are. Maybe they're Language and Human Rights Act, but if you want to share some other solutions, I think we all want to hear them. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question. Microphone there. Yep.
Thank you very much, Anthony Small. I'm curious to expand further on the question of foreign interference in the sector. So we're aware that regimes like the Russian regime, the Iranian regime, often use the patina of human rights to try and legitimize what is otherwise completely illegitimate exercises of power. You know, the Russian regime is denazifying Ukraine. We have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard government taking over the Human Rights Council in certain instances in the UN. When that filters down into the discussions of human rights in the West, how do we respond to that, and how do we in our own institutions future-proof them? And, you know, there's obviously a question of Iranian foreign interference in Australia today, and given recent revelations by ASIO, and issues around Russian interference in the cyberspace.
Great. Thank you. Last one, Drew, your choice.
I think you mentioned the issue of fragility of diversity and how important that is in Australia. And I'm just wondering what tips you would have to equip leadership to better manage that fragility and to embrace it. It strikes me that it takes a lot of cognitive load and emotional investment to be interested and considerate of others, and to consider some of those nuanced conversations that you were talking about before. So how can Australian leadership and business leaders do more of that?
Great. So the people want some solutions in 5 minutes or less. So we've got solutions around, you know, that you're going to provide us with shortly, and then also questions around foreign interference and future-proofing that. Sally, you could sort that out. And then if Nick, you could deal with the fragility of polarisation and diversity. Got so much time.
Human Rights Act was one of them. National Anti-Racism Framework is something that my colleague, the Race Discrimination Commissioner, Giri Sivaraman, launched last year. 63 recommendations to transform society about how we address racism in this country, including, for example, positive duty in the Racial Discrimination Act, like we have in the Sex Discrimination Act, to be much more proactive. Instead of having discrimination laws relying on individuals to bring a complaint to change a system which is delivering injustice, you require the institution or the employer to take proactive action, supported by the regulator, the Human Rights Commission, with resources and training, and this is about your question as well, policies and procedures, so you make it easy for employers to do the right thing, because most employers want to do the right thing. I used to advise employers 25 years ago, and so the National Anti-Racism Framework, look forward to the government accepting that, starting with the task force to implement it is the key recommendation, and there's 63 recommendations there, including better media reporting around race, better racial literacy, cultural diversity, etc., and better laws and policies.
I'll take foreign interference then, shall I? I think the best way to guard against foreign interference is for us to build trust between each other and build trust with our institutions. And I say that because every time trust, particularly with our institution, is undermined that feeds into much of the propaganda that these foreign governments are trying to push. So if we are to talk about trust with our security agencies, that I think was undermined when, and forgive me for being political here, but I think that was undermined when some members of parliament questioned people getting their citizenship. And that was something that took place during the campaign, and it's also some more recent discussions around who should be able to come into this country, and is there some sort of political involvement there? What that message is a real undermining of our immigration department and our bureaucracy and our security agencies, because all of those people who were at a citizenship ceremony and receiving their citizenship had gone through all the processes. Everyone knows the citizenship ceremony is the last step. You have gone through years of being tested, of having your entire life trod through in order to get that ceremony. And if that ceremony, the legitimacy of you being able to get your citizenship at that ceremony, the questioning of that undermines the entire process before. And so I think making sure that we build that trust between each other and in institutions helps to guard against foreign interference, because those governments in some of those countries that you've mentioned, one of the things that they do push out to their communities is that you will never be accepted. You may think that you're an Australian citizen, that you live in Australia, but they don't really accept you. They kind of see you as other. And if you feed into that, if you make them feel like other, if you kind of ongoing questioning of their loyalty, you feed into what those governments overseas are telling them. So I think what we need to do is to absolutely be squarely focused on what foreign interference looks like, how other governments could be trying to interfere in our political processes, because that's deeply damaging, and we've got to guard against that. And the best guard against that is to have strong institutions to be able to detect it, but also trust with the communities who would see foreign interference first. If we can say to the Chinese community, for example, or the Iranian community, are you noticing some of these things? You can trust in our institutions, you can trust in our security agencies to report it. That's the best way for us to get that information and the best way to guard against foreign interference.
In many ways, I wish we could recapture the spirit that Australia had 25 years ago. What was happening 25 years ago? The Olympics were about to happen 25 years ago. It was a great celebration of what Australia could be. The opening ceremony was a retelling of the Australian story in a way that had never been told. I think a joyous way, an inclusive way, one that recognised the modern face of Australia, one that was fun and kind of angst-free. And rather than this century being defined by what happened in September 2000, which was the Sydney Olympics, politics in this century got defined by what happened in September 2001, and that was 9/11. And that led to the Tampa election. And I think that election has freaked out both sides of politics. Well, not freaked them out. I think the Liberals saw a model of how to win elections. And I think Labor were so freaked out that the Liberals have found a model to win elections that it really impacted the debate about diversity in Australia in a way that we are still finding today. In answer to your question, how do you tell a better story about diversity and the success of diversity in this country? One that recognises the historical problems, one that recognises the first legislative act of this country was the White Australia policy. But, you make the case that Australia moved beyond that. I mean, I do believe that Australia could be the most successfully multicultural country in the world. I really believe that. But for that to happen, you need national leadership that will make that case in a very powerful and evocative and a different way. It just seems to be both sides of politics haven't made that case particularly well over the past 25 years.
Yeah, and I think you all raise great points around trust. We're at a point where trust in the media, trust in business, trust in government are at actually record lows. Transparency of government is very low, even with the current government. Issues around protest, where our voices are being, curtailed in many areas. But also, I think we also have to get a lot better at having uncomfortable conversations. Too often, we're too worried about what we might say or staying in our silo that we're not prepared to often speak about uncomfortable things in a constructive way. And, as Stan Grant mentioned a while ago, that we're not having those hard conversations. We're not speaking hard truths, or we're only speaking them within our circle. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm very thankful for each of you giving up your time, and I'm sorry Noreen wasn't able to get here. She did just text that she landed. Oh, no. So she is out of Canberra. So on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Institute, I really want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for coming out on a rainy night in Sydney means you are a gold star human rights defender, so we thank you for that. In particular, thank Kylie and Drew from the Institute, but all of the Institute team and our students who are here tonight for bringing this together. And our sponsors, Morris Blackburn, Gilbert and Tobin, Hall and Wilcox, we thank you for that. This is the first in a month-long series that UNSW is holding around its Diversity Festival. The next two that are coming up, one is focused on disability rights and the other is focused on LGBTQI+ issues. So it's on UNSW's website and our website, so please have a look at those and join them. For us, this is very much the start of a debate, and I hope you continue to join us each year. But now the most important part of the evening, please find friends within the human rights community, have a drink, and thank you for coming. And thank you to our 3 Auslan interpreters, most of all. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done.